How about you? I've spoken a lot.
I'm fine. I'm fine. Weather's changing, so it's allowing me to sit outside, do some writing in a cafe, which is good. So that's been a good development here on the island. A lot of the rest of Canada is still in a lockdown of some form or another, so we've been a bit lucky.
That's nice. We have been out of the confined for the lockdown for a while now.
Hmm.
And by the way, how was your second vaccine experience?
I haven't had the second one yet,
Oh yeah.
so yeah, I'm supposed to phone and get registered. So I've kind of been procrastinating, but I'll get to it.
Well, mine was pretty bad.
The second experience, the
Yes.
second one.
3 days
Oh,
of fever.
wow. Was that AstraZeneca or was it
Pfizer.
Pfizer? Huh.
First one was light, no issues, everything went smooth. And the second one, it was not painful, but fever, constant fever.
Wow. I'd not heard that people are having stronger reactions to the second one. I heard it was the other way around. So, well, it's different with everybody, right? So,
Important is that we have a vaccine. That's what
yeah, no
matters.
kidding. Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna get started with my first
Hmm.
question. There's this little conversation between Mappo and Icarium at the Temple of Shadow, where they find these books, very expensive bindings, and they are about dispersal of seeds and all sorts of little
Mm.
nonsensical stuff. And uh, Mappo counters that in this case, in this society, was destroyed by indolence in the form of obsessive pursuit of knowledge. And he claims that there's no difference between knowing little and knowing everything, and he uses Gothos as proof. And I've been wondering about this idea that knowledge is actually futile. You have it, you don't have it, you still end up the same place.
Possibly. Um, I think it relates more to making an informed decision as opposed to an uninformed one. Um, that's where knowledge is helpful. Um, but at the same time, you can think in terms of knowledge also can um, I guess create a mindset where you are entirely aware of the consequences of the decisions you're going to make. Um, Whether that stops a person from making those decisions is up to them. But I think in Mappo's case, or in the case of that scene, it's more um, probably commenting on, especially if you look at the sciences and the social sciences, there's a kind of esoterica that's going on. It has been for a long time, where people are so over specialized that it's difficult to actually take a holistic view in terms of interpreting their data. Um, and I mean that happens in archaeology. It happens in plenty of social sciences, and it can be frustrating because it's the knowledge almost gets in the way. The knowledge of the specific gets in the way of understanding of the general. So that's probably where Matt will sort of just make a comment on that. Yeah, I wouldn't put too much weight to his
It
commentary.
is an interesting idea.
Mm.
So basically, what my grandmother used to say, that you cannot see things because your eyeglasses are on your nose.
Mm. Kind of, yeah.
Um, Heboric, he thinks to himself about Felician as numb, yet with a growing need for feeling, so much so that even pain will do. And this is probably a phenomenon that people who haven't faced trauma and addiction are not really, probably don't really understand how the mechanism works, the seeking of feeling, even in the form of pain.
Hmm.
Obviously, you recognize and try to explain here. Would you like to explain the phenomenon a little, how you see it working?
Uh, well, I don't know if I can. I think it's probably it's probably an attempt. I mean, there's a lot of dissociation that goes on. And there's a lot of, defense mechanism is to distance yourself from your body, from what you're experiencing, and from being present in the moment. And so, and then of course, there's the very basic human need to actually feel that you are in the world and you are part of the world. And so if your defense mechanisms have disassociated you, then you do things to actually reinforce, I guess, the validity of your existence. And that's how, things like self-harming will come up. It's delivering a pain, just to kind of remind yourself that you're there, that you exist. But, I'm not a psychologist. And so, I'm just, my father was. So, I mean, we talked a lot about all kinds of things, but that was many years ago. So basically, when I'm writing up characters, I work hard anyways at making them in some way psychologically, internally consistent. Even their inconsistencies are consistent, if you will, because we're not singular in our interactions with the world or with other people. So as long as there's a rationale, that the potential of a rationale that exists in the character in terms of explaining their own actions, then I'm kind of happy with letting that, just going with that. It doesn't have to be a rationale anybody else can sort of get behind or support, but people do things for a myriad, a variety of reasons, and they're not necessarily consistent. So it's part of the human condition, and that's the thing that's always, it's what pulls me into even the notion of telling a story to begin with, is exploring that kind of thing.
Well, you may not be a psychologist, but one thing that I think every fan agrees with is that you have a special understanding of, I don't even want to call it psychology or the human soul, but you have a feeling for it.
Well, if I do, then it's more instinctive, and then I have to go back and try to sort of put it into rational context. But I mean, from early on, I was always sort of trying to sort of place myself in somebody else's perspective, just to try to make sense. If there's a bully on the playground or whatever, so going way back, just try to figure out where they're coming from, so I could, in some sense, understand and make sense of the world around me and how people behave, and then how I behave, same thing. So
During the sandstorm, Kalam stops at Ladro Keep, where he witnesses a reading of the deck. The reading begins with Obelisk, and Kalam says that any seer of talent would know that Obelisk is inactive in 7 cities. But Obelisk stands for time. Now, we know why death is inactive in Leatheras, but why would time be inactive in 7 cities?
oh wow, probably this is probably going way too far back for me to remember. But if I were to try to piece it together, everything was kind of held suspended because of the actual nature of Shaik. The fact that she, and this is spoilers, obviously, so maybe I won't go any further with that, but her origins are outside of time, if you think about it. Where, or rather, she's a being that experienced a ritual that frozen in time. So as long as she was ascendant on 7 cities, then it was as if things could not move forward.
Speaking of, I'm going to give a heads up for spoilers because some of the questions are going to be major spoilers that go all the way to, I don't know, the crippled god maybe. So beware, whoever proceeds, caution.
Mm.
Down in Iskaral's temple, Mappo and Icarium find a secret passage behind blocks of granite. After they remove the blocks, they find bowls of cedar, old ones, and Mappo wonders how did they get them so deep inside the temple. Icarium says that they brought them by Warren and that the Warren feels like Kural Gelain, but not quite. And then he adds that the only elder Warrens he knows of are Kural Gelain, Omtos Falak, Telan, and Starwald Emelaine. Now this is a little suspicious. I mean, weird that none of them knows about the other Teist Warrens.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Icarium, you can say that maybe his memory is affected, but what about Mappo?
Mm-hmm.
How come they don't know?
I don't think Mappo did any interactions with Taistadur while escorting Icarium. So those would be, yeah, that would be Icarium's knowledge from way back, which has not survived his latest iteration. But you're right; it's definitely pointing to Curl Emerlon. So it's foreshadowing various things that will show up. I guess in House of Chains, Midnight Tides. Yeah.
Midnight Tides, I think.
Mm.
The next question is also related to the same scene because they find these carvings or tiles and with carvings on them. That's basically a deck of the holds.
Mm-hmm.
Practically the same thing that the Sira has in Leather, and they
Mm-hmm.
had been defaced, but what seemed to be soul taken and diverse claws.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe it's the defacing that gets Icarium to feel like this is Kural de Mulan, Kural,
Which one?
Ghislaine,
Emerald?
Ghislaine, the dark one. But I'm thinking this actually is a former temple of the Taist Edur, which makes sense because that's why Shadowthorn will be choosing it for his temple.
Certainly possible if you can work out sort of if that's consistent from what you've read, then that would be probably the case. Yeah, I can't tell you now. I don't remember.
It just does that. It feels like Kural Ghislaine, but it feels corrupted. It's similar, but not quite. It hints that maybe the defacing is causing the feeling, but I'm thinking that the feeling comes from the fact that they're brothers.
Possibly, yeah.
Which also brings the very interesting idea that the Taistedur were on 7 cities at some point.
Yes, but not necessarily. I can't explain anything further on that because that relates to Walk in Shadow.
Oh, I'm stumbled upon a gem. Let's see. Oh, this is a good one. When confronted by Mappo about what they found, the gate and the temple, Iskaral wonders why they had. He starts rambling like always, and he says, "Why haven't these two ascended like the rest of them, being such old wanderers of this mortal earth?" And then he also gives the answer because longevity doesn't automatically bestow wisdom. And while I completely agree with the statement, it did raise the question. There are so many ways to ascend. Why is wisdom necessary for these two and not for the others?
I don't know. I mean, kind of the way we approach ascendancy in our books, it's almost a thing that occurs in spite of the efforts of the individual. So in other words, if somebody is seeking to ascend, they're going to have a harder battle getting there than somebody who simply proceeds with their life and their choices and decisions that have profound consequences that create a kind of a ripple in reality. And that can be what drags a person into ascendancy, whether they like it or not. So Gruntle would be a good example of that.
So in Icarium's case, his loss of memory and maybe the murder spree he goes into from time to time, would that be the reason why he cannot ascend because a part of him is missing?
Possibly, or he may have ascended multiple times. But if you don't remember, then you proceed from a position of starting over again. And so he's repeating a whole process. And I think there's always an element of one's belief system shaping the reality around them. So probably playing with that notion as well.
This one is a little more personal. I listened a while ago to your first interview on the 10 Big Books podcast. And India asked you at some point two questions. What's your favorite food? And what food can you find only in Canada? You asked the second one, I think it was some kind of golden fish or something of the sort, but not the first one. So what is your favorite food?
God, do I even have a favorite food? I like spaghetti bolognese. It's one of the meals that I find the most filling, and makes me want to sleep afterwards, and that's quite nice. But probably the other food was probably goldeye, which is a type of fish, a freshwater fish. Smoked goldeye is pretty extraordinary. So, yeah, good for India for asking the questions, but yeah.
There was a comment that Fiddler makes at some point that he points at something I haven't thought of before, that Kalimved and the Malazans, they always knew the difference between conquering and occupying. And that's a very interesting distinction.
Yeah, it's they're two different things for sure. But I mean, don't forget, this is an expansionist empire, so its founding premise is suspect, and at that point, one has to sort of take all of this, as not suggestive of this is the way to do it, but rather that if you're going to be doing this, if you're going to be expanding as an empire, what you do with the conquered lands and conquered territories will have a huge effect on the cohesiveness of the empire, further down the road. So the Romans were very good at it. Even when they ended the Punic Wars and destroyed Carthage and razed it to the ground and all the rest. They didn't go out and destroy all the other Carthaginian villages and towns and small cities and all the rest through in the what used to be the Carthaginian Empire. What they did was they basically set about Romanizing Carthaginians to the point where they ended up feeling as Roman as anyone else. And so there are all different ways of doing this. You do this in terms of belief systems, the worshiping of gods, not rejecting the local worship and the local pantheon, but just slowly infiltrating it, if you will, and bestowing citizenship and all kinds. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can sort of cement that shift of identity and self-identity. And I think the way Cam and I played out the empire, we were following along those lines in the gaming as well. So
pretty much the same thing happened here. To this day, we celebrate our Latinity a lot more than who we used to be before. It's like a shadow in history.
Yeah, not at all uncommon. No.
Which reminds me, speaking of Romans and Romanian history, I'd be meaning to ask you, there's this old theory that I found in an old historical magazine. My father was a fan of these magazines. He had a subscription since he was 13 years old. So by the time I was a child, he had a treasure hoard worth of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to tell him one day that there's something wrong with our history. There's a lot of time missing. And he confirmed to me that basically there are 1,000 years missing, smack in the middle of our history, and nobody's talking about it. So basically we get...
Do you know when those 1,000 years?
Yep.
Like what years?
approximately after the Roman retreat south of the Danube until 1200, year 1200 or something of the sort.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
only information we have is about 3 little warlords around the year 900. But I don't think they occupied more than 30, 60 kilometers area each. So that doesn't apply for the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all we have. And even then, apparently, the information comes from some sort of historical book that is contested as a work of fiction rather than of history. And so we don't know if even that is true.
Yeah. Yeah. It could be History of the Goths. That one is generally viewed as fictional. Um, well, it's a good reminder of how cultures and civilizations can simply vanish and leave no trace. Um, and at that period, you're looking at huge migrations from the east. Um, and so those are wagon and horse cultures. And they don't, I mean, apart from burial grounds like barrows and stuff, they don't leave much trace. Um, their settlements would be seasonal, temporary, constantly shifting. So somebody camping in one place for one season and then moving further west afterwards, you could come back to that campground 2 months later and find no sign that anybody had ever camped there. I mean, the traces would just be so minimal. Um, so it's not that Romania was empty during that period. It was just that you had these populations moving through, and many of them were not necessarily pre-literate, but not necessarily bound to literacy either. So they wouldn't be writing things down. Um, they'd be probably more bound to oral traditions and kind of the social cohesiveness of a religion or faith. And that manifests in the barrows and the burial practices. Um, and of course, the problem there is barrows and mounds get looted, and quite often they're looted, 2 years after they've been built. So again, you don't get much in the way of artifactual evidence or remains. So I'm not surprised that you had that 1,000-year gap. Um, People were there; they just haven't left any really discernible traces. That was a period in which um, the migrations were extraordinary. A lot of it was triggered by climate change and drought in the central steppes, and that just drove people in their herds ever westward. So, and then it's only a few sort of narrow chutes of land that you can travel through to break out of the steppes north of the Black Sea into Europe. And so I think Romania has at least one of those sort of narrow corridors. So yeah, fascinating. I will have to visit sometime because I love to walk some of the plains, the high plains and stuff. Yeah.
That would
Really.
be that would be nice to have you here. Well, I'm still trying. I haven't given up, but with the whole pandemic,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I was actually coming to the point of politics and these missing 1,000 years, because the main purpose of communists when they rewrote our history was continuity. And
Mm-hmm.
according to this 40-year-old magazine by now, Transylvania is contested. The ownership of a Transylvania is contested between us and Hungary, always has been. And this magazine, and I'm saying it's a 40-year-old source, so to be taken with a grain of salt, was saying that the Hungarian historians had come with this theory that when the Romans retreated to the south, the entire population of Romania also retreated, or Dacia back then, and that the land remained unoccupied for 1,000 years. And then the population that returned were not Romanians. It was a different Latin origin population, but not the original occupiers. And therefore, we do not have the same a strong claim to Transylvania, or at least we have an equal claim as they have.
Right, right. Well, I mean, one would have to know like you say, the politics involved at the time when it came to national identity, and to what extent that can actually alter the interpretations of evidence. I mean, you get that it's ongoing, for example, for Russia and the rise of Kiev as originally a Rus or Scandinavian trader settlement as the origin of the state in Russia. And, so Russian scholars will argue, no, the Vikings had no role to play at all. It was all Slavs. And Northern European scholars would argue the opposite. And it's the ideologies that are in play. It's the politics. It's we're always challenged in terms of interpreting the evidence. And people think, well, okay, you dig something up and that's proof of something. Well, not really. It's not proof of anything. Artifacts travel through time. For example, you can be digging here, say in Canada, in the plains, a late woodland prehistoric site. So pottery, certain types of stone tools and projectile points. And then suddenly in the same strata, you'd stumble across something that's 4,000 years old. And so you think, well, where did that come from? And somebody could interpret, well, you had this continuity of people here, and this one artifact got rafted up by rodent tunneling in the earth and whatever. And so it's just that continuity. Whereas an alternate explanation would be somebody in 900 AD was wandering around and found an old arrowhead, an old spear point that was 4,000 years old, and took it home. And suddenly, there's nothing to it. In other words, artifacts can travel through time within the past, not just to our present. People find things they like, and they carry them with them, and that thing can be immensely old. And you find it later as an archaeologist, and suddenly it throws out your timeline completely. So yeah, it's I'd have to look at what kind of archaeology was going on, not just then but now in Romania regarding that time period, and whether people have begun excavating settlements that fill that gap. I mean, what's happening now is a lot of people are not even bothering with the excavations. First of all, there's no money for it, and then if it's the kind of excavations that happen now, it's mitigation. So you're rescuing, you're salvaging because a highway's going in or something like that. And those ones, the analysis and the reports of the dig generally are years away if they ever show up at all. It's just the job is basically to get everything out that you can, and then you put it in boxes and it sits somewhere in a lab. So the answers will probably come from genetic analysis rather than archaeology. So if somebody wants to prove, which populations moved into the area, or whether there was an indigenous population that was always there and then got admixed with new populations, you can determine that now pretty closely genetically. And but again, it may not be ideologically favorable. Yeah.
Actually, according to the magazine, they were saying that there's no evidence from this period, no burial grounds, no pottery, no coins, not even references from historians of different countries talking about what's going on here. And I have a friend who's an archaeologist, and I dared him to tell me of any dig that he knows of from that period. And I could see his face going blank and telling me, no, this is not possible. We're not having 1,000 missing years. It's not possible. but he couldn't name one place where that he could think of from the period. It's
Mhm.
either Roman stuff or older, or past 400 years that I've seen going around archaeological discoveries.
Um, I mean, yeah, I mean, in some respects, that kind of shows up in other places like the UK, for example. It took a long time to find, an actual Anglo-Saxon village. Um, and the reasons are kind of amusing. Where towns are now is where those villages were then. And so your evidence is sitting under your feet, basically. Um, it takes a lot to empty out a settlement or a town. I remember wandering around in Cornwall on the moors and stuff and finding these medieval village ruins. And they were only empty because of plague. Otherwise, they'd still be occupied. There'd be nice houses there now, and there'd be a post office and all the rest. But it's just, this forlorn sight on the moors because too many people died in the plague for it to be reoccupied. And then there's another example of that in Opatia as well, up in the highlands above the coast. Same thing, emptied by malaria and never reoccupied. But generally, people stay, where previous generations found it useful and advantageous to live, and so sometimes the evidence is right under our feet, and because we've got houses and parking lots and all the rest, you just don't find it. Conversely, Romania could have been, if it was a narrow corridor for transhuman migration, then it could have been like the Wild West. It could have been extremely violent. Nobody hung around there. There was no security. It was a risky place to be. You
Oh,
had
that's not
marauder.
new. It still
Sorry?
goes on. That's not new. It still goes on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that can depopulate an area for sure, especially post Roman Empire, because the empire provided the security and stability. This is what these people were looking for. Um, they were being pushed out by the Huns, and the Huns were just again being pushed out by climate change. So they were on the move and they were pushing west, and so they pushed all these tribes and peoples ahead of them, and those tribes would then run up against the Roman border and beg to be let inside. They weren't coming to conquer; they were coming for protection. And then the Romans treated them badly, and then they turn around and conquer the Romans. So
It just hit me thinking about it. The theory cannot be correct because the first mention of Timișoara in written in some historians in a different area of the world is around the year 400 as Castrum Timisiensis. So if Timișoara was here in the year 400, that's after the Romans left. Therefore, the theory that there was nobody here is not valid. So yeah, what
yeah,
talking to people can do.
mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot to empty a landscape of people. Um, climate change can certainly do it. Um, there's, I mentioned this before, but there's a Roman port. I think it's Caesarea on the North African coast, but it's not on the coast. It's 10 miles inland, but it's a port, and of course it's abandoned. And it's abandoned because silts and climate change and deforestation and you know goats. Goats are horrible when it comes to sort of allowing a landscape to reinvigorate itself. So all these things happen, and you silt up the harbor, and suddenly there's no more reason to be there, and so people pick up and leave. But so climate change is one of the great sort of drivers of migration among humans, and it's kind of a domino effect. The Huns wouldn't have been moving west if the pastures and everything else was just fine on the steppes. They would have stayed where they were.
You almost always provide us the view from the other camp.
Hmm.
We get to know one group of characters and we get attached, and they have their enemy, and then suddenly we are on the other side of the story and we get to know the enemy and we get to like them, like the case of the Malazans and then Korab. But for some reason, we never got to see the Dog Slayer's point of view.
Hmm.
Why
The
did you
book
make
was
the
big
choice?
enough. It was big enough. I couldn't really fit much more. And it was the case that I wanted the focus to be on this outnumbered, beleaguered, small, well, relatively small, migrating population, um, where the dog slayers and the entire place that's in rebellion almost constitutes um, a faceless natural disaster that's afflicting this chain of dogs on their way out. So, in that sense, it was a deliberate decision on my part to give us only the one side of that one, because I knew we were going to get to the other side when we got to House of Chains. So,
Because I was thinking, like,
purposes.
in Memories of Ice, we get to see the Panion army and the evil seer domains and all that stuff. And then in Tall the Hounds, we get to meet our seer domain and we get to see how they themselves perceived what was going on. But we
Mhm.
never had that with a chain of dogs, with the dog slayers.
Well, curiously, I mean, I gave it a lot of thought because I knew that what this was going to create was a whole series of new cults and religions. And so, in many respects, the story of the chain of dogs is the foundational story for the birth of a major religion. And that's touched on now in The God Is Not Willing. It's mentioned. Um, and it's not discussed in great detail, but Coltane is definitely uh, almost the dominant uh, religious figure, if you will, the dominant god or ascendant in Seven Cities now. So I knew there was going to be a long-lasting repercussions and legacy to the Chain of Dogs, and that's probably why I kept it entirely with Coltane and Company, because what the reader is getting is they're getting the details of that actual chain of dogs. But what everybody who fought, in the rebellion and fought against, so the dog slayers, they would only ever get parts of it. Wherever they engaged with the chain of dogs, they would get that little fragment of it. And I wanted that to stay fragmentary, because each one of those was going to then create a mythos, a mythology, a story, almost like agnostic in a sense, or Gnostic rather. Um, so you have all these versions, interpretations of the chain of dogs from various dog slayers who may have participated, or may tell people they participated, or maybe their fathers and mothers participated, but they didn't, and on it goes. And from all of these things, you then just sort of generate this flux of legend and mythology around the chain of dogs. So it would be less effective, I think, if I were to have included a dog slayer's point of view, because that then would have been the definitive point of view of how the dog slayers interacted with the chain of dogs. And I didn't want anything definitive. I wanted it all out there in just clouds of dust. So that when the religion arises, it arises from the mysteries of the chain of dogs as perceived by the natives of Seven Cities. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. Uh, This one is not really a question, more like this is awesome. Both the idea and the humor. A quote from Uncle Bolt, who says that wise words are like arrows. When you see them coming at you, you duck. So this, I think this was one of the funniest things I've read in Deadhouse Gates.
Well, it's probably it's what almost every parent will ever think at some point in their lives. But yeah.
During the scene where Sormod takes Duiker and Kalp to the oasis and he tries to open his warren, um, he explains that the souls there, the spirits of the land, are closest to the Tlanimas. And since they have imbibed, and when Duiker tells him that the Tlanimas have abandoned all empire things after the death of Kellanved, Sormo replies by saying that, uh, asking why didn't, if he ever found it weird and wondered why. To which Duiker thinks to himself that he did have his suspicions, but to voice them to anyone would be treason. Now, I've been thinking, what could he be thinking about? I have a few ideas, but what was he thinking about? Why would it be
Well,
treason?
if you have a few ideas, what are they?
Well, for one, I figured he might have or pieced together the ascension of Shadow Throne and Cotillion, but this is my second go-to. My first idea is that if the Tlanimas answered to Kellanved, then that means they no longer answer to Lassine, and to say that would jeopardize her power, and she would lose the threat of the Tlanimas over the conquered nations, and to say it would cost him his life. So I
Yeah,
figured that
yeah, got it.
that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Um, One of the smaller storylines weaved in the books is basically the love story between Fiddler and his Graal horse. It's really nice. It's starting with the his first thought when he buys the horse, thinking what a big price the Graal are paying for civilization and how cheap that horse came for him.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course, uh, the man whose face the horse bites. I liked how you left that man unnamed and then brought the same unnamed man in the Bone Hunters, and whoever can gets it, and whoever doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
That was a stroke of genius. I remember going through the Bone Hunters the first time and thinking, this man is familiar. There's something about this character that rings a bell, but not quite. And by the
Mm.
end of the scene, I had figured it out, and I was like, wow, this is cool. This is gorgeous. And then, of course, the final scene in Raraku where they're being attacked by Soul Taken and Diverse, and Fiddler gets angry at the horse, who by this point was loyal.
Mm.
That scene actually reminds me of Calor in Tall the Hounds, because
Mm.
he too has that memory of getting
Mm-hmm.
angry with his horse because the horse reared and took the spear in his chest.
Mm-hmm.
So Fiddler was pretty much doing the same thing, getting angry at the horse because the horse was shielding him with his own body.
Yep.
To think it tried to kill him at first, and then after the first fight scene in Gdanisban, even the comment that the horse was now thinking that maybe Fiddler is not that bad, just because he saw him fighting. It's a really beautiful storyline.
Yeah, horses are curious beasts, that's for sure. Yeah.
Uh, Karsar refusing his name to strangers, that was a pretty cool way for you to hide his identity from us until House of Chains.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get the idea?
Because I knew I was going to be telling a story that would lead up to the meeting that we got in Deadhouse Gates, but I wouldn't be telling it until the fourth book. So I wanted to, I wanted to sort of have that reveal have as much impact as possible.
That and the story of the Silanda, we
Mm-hmm.
see the latest arrivals in the first book and the first arrival in the latest. We begin with uh, well, Heboric and Gessler and Stormy, which were the last ones to find it. Karsa had already been there, and Binadas got his share before that. And we just get to see them opposite. The story, the books go one way, and the
Yeah.
timeline goes different. That was brilliant.
Well, the Karsa encounter on the Solanda was actually gamed. Um, I remember that very specifically. That Marc's character was in the sea and was pulled out onto the ship, and he was playing Karsa very well. And Karsa just sort of, rather than actually have proper conversations, just pulled out a sword and started killing everybody. And then I remember he kicks his way into um, cabin and throws a spear, and it pins the guy to the chair. And I thought that was such an interesting sort of session of gaming that there was no way I could leave it out of the series. But I would come at it from the other end, and so you would see the consequences without the rest of it, and then it gave you the opportunity to eventually get to that at some point. So it's one of the things that happens with gaming is that you don't keep everything, but the stuff that worked is what you're going to mine later as you proceed in the story.
Since we're about Selenda and Karsa, this was gonna come at some later point, but I'm taking advantage of the open door. This question is courtesy of AP. I was thinking of ignoring it, but he said it would make an interesting conversation with Steve. Go ahead. So I'm gonna go ahead.
All right.
The scene where the scene that Heboric finds, the aftermath of Karsa's charge, there's this huge spear coming out from Binadas's chest, which is unnamed at this point. And Heboric identifies it as as a historian as a Bargas spear. And Kolb keeps saying it's too big to be Bargast, and says, I don't know, it is Bargast. Now we find out later on in Memories of Ice that the Bargast are part Imas and part Toblakai, which would make perfect sense. Only the problem is that in House of Chains, Karsa kills Binadas with a seal harpoon, not with a spear. So,
well, the Bargast are they're a coastal adapted, so in that respect, yeah, it's a harpoon. But in terms of the Heboric looking at this thing, he's not going to know a harpoon from a spear. As far spear is kind of a generic phrase. I mean, quite often, even in fantasy, what people describe as spears aren't spears; they're javelins. If you throw it, it's not a spear; it's a javelin. So, but and it's one of those. Yeah, it's just a generic usage that we see a lot of. And I I'm guilty of it as well. But in this case, yeah, it's a harpoon. But the Bargas they're whalers, and they're out in the waters, and they hunt big creatures out there. So even though it's a very specific hunting implement, the techniques of manufacture will be very similar to that of a spear. Culturally, they will look the same because the same hands are making both. So it's more laziness on Heboric's part, or rather ignorance on Heboric's part, which is fine. I mean, I always was annoyed by, in D&D campaigns that you would buy, that every NPC that you ask questions of, not only did they openly answer you, even though you're a stranger, you just showed up asking questions, but they were, invariably accurate in their in what they told you. And to me, both of those things are ridiculous. I may end up, now that I think about it, it'd be a great character. Maybe in a Bokalena Corporal Brooch novella where it's your classic barkeep who's got all the answers, but then all the answers are wrong. I could have a lot of fun with that, actually. So, he's one of those ones who, yeah, if a stranger comes up and asks him about, I don't know, secret tombs in the hills, he'll tell them all about it in your classic D&D campaign style, and give them a mission even, and off they go. And of course, it's completely erroneous and gets them all killed. Sounds like fun.
Well, my curiosity and my question to AP was, well, how do you identify it as Bargast? Does it have any art on the handle? Does it have any fetishes tied to it? What makes it identifiable as Bargast? And that's why I said that this would be an interesting conversation with you.
Um, Probably because it's a harpoon. That particular technology is very specific, in terms of cultures that are seafaring enough to actually hunt something like whales or seals, for that matter. So there wouldn't be many alternatives, like non-Bargast whalers in that same area. You would just have Bargast whalers. Uh, I mean, you're right. You can find harpoons being um, pulled up from the seabed um, off the coast of the Netherlands, that are your classic bone harpoons that would look very little different from, say, Dorset harpoons of northern Canada, simply because the technological solution to hunting seafaring animals is kind of consistent, either using nets, weirs, or harpoons, and so the designs will be quite similar. But in this case, it's a cultural thing. It's an anthropological thing. These are Bargast harpoons. They could be weighted differently. They could be using um, walrus tusk, instead of narwhal bone or horn or whatever. So yeah, I throw it out there and it can sit out there. It's fine. I'm happy with it.
All throughout Deadhouse Gates, we are made to believe that Absalar is in danger, that she might become the new Shaikh. At least Iskar is trying for it because they hope to control it since she was affiliated with Shadow. But
yeah,
I think that this was actually a false trail all along, and it wasn't just in Deadhouse Gates, but meant to be Felician. I think I found a proof in a little quote. Since I was a child, Shaikh Karin, her voice brittle, one vision has possessed me above all others. I have seen this moment, Leomin, 1,000 times. At dawn, I shall open the book, and a whirlwind shall rise, and I shall emerge from it renewed. Blades in hands and unhindered in wisdom, such are the wind's words. Young yet old, one life whole, another incomplete. I have seen it, Leomin. Now you could see that blades in hands and unhindered wisdom is Absalar possessed by Cotillion. One knows, one wise, one not. But here it's about a merging of the two personalities. So part has to be Shaikh and part the new part, the new entity. So blades in hands would be Drijna and unhindered wisdom would be the new host. The same for the young yet old, one life whole, another incomplete. So it's not about what Dancer or Cotillion did to Absalar. It's about um, Felician and Drijna.
Yep. But also the unhanded is also a reference to Hiboric. So
I was wondering what unhindered in wisdom means, and I couldn't get it. So that's where it comes from. I remember I asked a Malazan friend who is native English speaker, what does it mean unhindered in wisdom? Because I don't really get the meaning. Maybe it's a language difference. And he told me, honestly, I have no idea. So
Well, that's the thing. When you're dealing with prophecies, you want to be obscure. Yeah.
when you're not native, sometimes you don't know what's in the book and what's in here.
I bet. Yeah.
Another fragment I found as proof that it was always meant to be Felician is that she begins to have these dreams of a river of blood carrying her like flotsam. And she describes the river in her dreams as an embrace, comforting and welcoming. Um, and several times this is mentioned, and although the precise timing and when the dreams begin is not delivered, it seems to be after the death of Shaikh Elder. So she was being called by Drishna all along. It would have never been Apsalar.
No. No. But the narrative is set up in such a way as to leave it, open for the reader to choose one or the other. And I was assuming most would choose Apsalar. That was kind of the plan.
You did to us what Iskaral was doing to the soul taken and diverse.
Yeah.
Sneaky. There is an epigram that talks about the fact that a lot of cults proliferated in the Malazan armies, particularly among the Marines, and that it should be remembered that this was the time of Dasem Ultor, supreme commander of the Malazan armies, a man sworn to Hud. Now, that clicks a few things. Was the entire Malazan army unknowingly in the service of Hud because of Dasem? Is that what the epigram is hinting at?
I can't answer that because of where Cam is writing Paths to Ascendancy.
Okay, stumbled upon another one. This one is a long and complicated one. The scene where Benneth beats Felician. He takes her as an offering to Captain Sawark. The captain's face goes wide when he sees her, when he realizes who is being offered to him. Then the very next thing, he asks Benneth if Boden is his man, if they work together. Benneth denies it. Felician looks at the two of them and thinks, while being high, that none of them believes the other. But some silent exchange of information happens between the captain and Benneth that we, the reader, do not know. After that, he takes her out. He's angry. He keeps asking, "Who are you? Who is Boden to you?" And I was trying to understand what's going on. It indicates that Captain Sawark knew that Felician was Tavor's sister, and that Boden was a talon assigned to guard her, or at the very least, a guardian. And the only way he would have known that is if a claw told him. And if the claw knew, then Lasine knew.
No, Claw wouldn't have told him. A Talon would have told him. So Lasine would not know.
Okay, well, that makes sense. That was the missing part, because I was wondering how could he know?
Yeah, he was part of the original plan to get Felician out, and the rebellion just screwed it all up.
That's another thing I didn't catch on. There was a lot of stuff that was unclear, left on purpose unclear, and even after 2-3 read-throughs, I didn't get it.
Yeah, and don't forget, Felician is the point of view primarily, because Haboric's not part of the plan as such, and Boden's not talking. So it's all Felician, and she is the most traumatized point of view in the entire section involving her. So it's going to be very cloudy what she's perceiving, because I have to write it in such a way that Felician doesn't understand what's going on, but she senses something is going on, and that's that's about as close as I can get to. Otherwise, it would run contrary to this drugged out 12, 13-year-old. It's just not going to pick these things, these nuances, these subtleties. They're not going to pick them up at all. And it's interesting to choose a point of view like that as a writing exercise. I highly recommend it. in House of Chains, that's Karsa. You know, Karsa and his two friends, when they head off, um, he is a profoundly unaware individual, and he's not entirely aware of the subtext of Thord and I can't remember his friend, is the other guy's name.
Something would be.
Yeah, it's with a B. Um, but those two are much smarter than Karsa. They're much sharper, and so there's a lot of subtext that's going on with them that Karsa is completely unaware of, and that's a lot of fun to write because um, you're constraining yourself with that point of view, which puts limits on just how much you can write and how much you can sort of say, and then everything else is yeah, it's going on uh, beyond his awareness, but it's right there in front of us anyways if we care to look at it. The thing is, lots of people don't because they've tied their allegiance to Karsa, so their sympathies or whatever, because it's Karsa's point of view for that whole opening section. We're on Karsa's shoulder. We're staying with Karsa. May not like it, but that's where we are, and that has an effect on the reader. So that when they, Benatas, I think, when they are dealing with the other characters, you're seeing it and reading it all from Karsa's point of view, and so Karsa will have that suspicion, he'll have that uncertainty, he'll have his arrogance, and they all shape what he is seeing. But as the writer, you're thinking, well, let's take this from the other guy's point of view, and work out how he would subtly dance around this powerful but not entirely self-aware character. And it's a fun exercise for sure.
I remember I hated Karsa so bad when I first ran into him. He is huge, he's dumb, he's arrogant. What's so special about this guy? Why are we sticking with him?
Mm.
I
Yeah.
hated him like hell.
Oh yeah, very arrogant. Yeah.
Arrogant enough to be oblivious to what was going on because he wasn't
Mm-hmm.
stupid. It was clear from the get-go that he wasn't stupid. He was just too full of himself to see the world around him.
Yeah, and he had been fed the wrong stories, in terms of his grandfather and all the rest. He bought into all of the tall tales, and that's kind of a lesson on how cultural history can really fuck up the next, the younger generation, um, because of all those tales, all those stories being told, and all the rest. Um, it sort of invites the cycle to repeat over and over again.
True. Um, so next one. Oh, after the beating, she begins to heal, but she still wants to go back to Benneth, and Hebori gives her a warning that now, if he takes her back, it's going to the way he was destroying her before, if it was random, now it's going to be intentional. And I was wondering why. Why would he want to destroy her? He assumes that Baudin's disappearance gave Bennett some leverage over the captain, and that the captain in return gave him background information on Felician. So if he knew who Felician was, what interest did he have in destroying her systematically, intentionally?
Well, because at that point he would be, and don't forget, this is just Hiboric's interpretation, but
Mhm.
he would be symbolically screwing over the authority that put him in that
Hmm.
prison to begin with.
Okay.
So it's a case of um, uh, what would be an example?
Taking revenge on a high court.
The overseer of a bunch of slaves brought into the master and being beaten by the master, and then the overseer leaves the room, goes among the slaves, and beats one of the slaves. In other words, it's passed down, right? It's added on. It's not like the that character or that person um, has somehow stepped back and worked out, well, these are the power dynamics, and I'm the one being abused here. It doesn't mean I have to pass on that abuse. That generally doesn't happen. It's the actions and the violence is simply repeated further down, as you go down the hierarchy. And I mean, that's culturally evident everywhere and has been throughout human history. The meek man bullied at his job and comes home and beats his wife. That's kind of how psychology plays itself out. Not always, but and so in this case, Bennett is basically repeating the cull, but he's got his own personal noble that he can inflict his fury upon. So it's that kind of repetition that I think Heborek is recognizing.
Mm-hmm. The attack of the bloodflies, that was absolutely horrible. And I've been wondering, how did you get inspired? And then you told the story of the pig in Mongolia, was it?
In Belize, yeah. Botflies, yeah. And all I did was I basically created a botfly on speed. I mean, my understanding of botflies is they lay eggs on blades of grass, and then the mosquitoes who are resting on the blades of grass, then the eggs attach to the proboscis of the mosquito. And so then when the mosquito bites an animal to draw blood, it implants the egg of the botfly in the hole that its proboscis made. And then the botfly hatches inside there and eats a little cavern underneath your skin, creates a little mound with a little hole in the center so it can stick its head out and breathe. So yeah, they're pretty nasty, horrible little things. And so for this, I just gave them wings and made them even nastier. So
before plunging down into the waters of Sinker Lake, Felician has a moment thinking about Bennett and how Boden didn't even look for him and that he must still be alive. And then she sinks into the waters who wash away the mud and the tincture from her skin. And there's this one sentence she thinks to herself right before sinking, as she notices that all the filth is washing away, and she thinks it was not nearly enough. That's a very short sentence, but for me it had quite an impact, that she's thinking of her own psychological emotional filth, and that the waters will never be enough to wash away that. And I would say it is the same feeling of dirtiness that women feel after being raped. I mean, she's often judged as a whore for trading her body in order to survive, and yet people seemed to fail to notice the fact that her giving consent to these business transaction actually took a price, a pretty big price. Mm-hmm. And that little sentence emphasizes how dirty and how bad she's actually feeling on the inside.
Yeah. It's the fact that victims often feel guilt is one of the most tragic aspects to these things. When basically, if someone could sort of sit them down and say, look, it's not your fault, and that's the hardest thing to actually get across, that circumstances were what they were, and one does what they have to do to survive, or conversely they don't.
What I found amazing about this thing, that it delivered so much information in just a handful of words. What was it? It wasn't nearly enough. 5 words, and yet so much came across for whoever has the wisdom to see it, at least.
Well, it's down to, I guess, it's reading styles, and different people have different reading styles, and some of them want to get to the action, some of them want to get to the end of the book, to having got to the end of the book to see how it plays out. And there are occasions I know that I'm reading some military SF somewhere, and I'm just not I'm not caught up enough in the characterizations or whatever, and all I really want to do is just, okay, well, how does this turn out plot wise? And I just start reading a lot faster. And you know, it's not a question of good readers and bad readers. It's a question of what it is you're trying to get out of what you're reading at that time. And it may be different the next year. You know, if you go back and read it, it may be completely different. And that's cool. I mean, that shows that who you were then is not who you are now. And, you know, that can be said at any moment in our lives, through any span of time. You know, who I am now is different from who I was yesterday. And that's, if it wasn't the case, life would be pretty boring, I think.
But my point wasn't the good reader versus bad reader, but more like personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
I have experienced the kind of guilt that she's gone through, not at the same level, but I know what she was feeling. So when I saw that sentence, it triggered a recollection. People who haven't experienced something similar, who don't know enough psychology, may not realize what that sentence is all about.
Sure.
That's what I was trying to say.
But yeah, but that's that, and there may be other scenes that other readers, you know, stopped by, that you just slipped past. You know, so it's you know it's always going to be there for individual readers to see. And I mean that's all a writer can hope for, is that somebody out there catches the significance of that line, this line, or that thought, this thought, what that character does versus what this character does, all these things. Yeah, well, at least I am. Anyways, I'm always looking to create resonance, I guess, in the reader. And because I have no way to predict which scenes will do it, I throw every scene imaginable in every iteration, in every version, every angle that I can think of, in the hope that one of them is that kind of emotional trigger. And because for me, that emotional trigger is what seduces the reader into the story. And you know that's my primary purpose, because where I'm heading to with the story is a place of hopefully deep felt emotion, and that was kind of my aim all along. So, for good or ill.
This one is going to be the last question tonight. I don't want to have very long interviews. People get bored. But that's going to make for more interviews, so that's all right. When Heboric and Boden and Felician, they go into Sinker Lake, they get under and in the caves. Boden realizes with anger that she lost his knife. And when they fight, she curses him and she just says, "Go to Hood, Boden." And I remember thinking the first time, that's unlike Steve, because it's too similar to go to hell. There's something about this curse here. Later on in Memories of Ice, I figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
But this was such cool foreshadowing.
Well, yeah, I was thinking what would be said at that point would be, as you say, go to hell, right? Because that's the sentiment and the anger and the, you know, the bitterness and all the rest is that's the phrase that we would use in our world. But I can't use that in the Malazan world because there is no real hell. So the obvious choice then would have been Hood. It begins with H as well, so it'll trigger in the reader to go to hell, and so they'll understand it in those terms. But then I realized, well, that's great, because if they understand it in those terms, they won't think about it again. But Hood and this particular curse is actually going to have repercussions later on. Yeah.
Oh, I just forgot my thought. That's okay. I wanted to say something and it's gone. I guess this is it then for tonight.
Okay.
It's nearly 12 a.m. here, so it's time.
Oh my. Well, this actually, let's see. Yeah, I got time. I'll probably go off and do some writing. So it's not raining out, I don't think. No, looks good.
Well, this was cool. I hope you had fun.
Yeah, it's been fun.
And see you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye. Bye, Claudia.
Bye. Have a nice day.
You too. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, definitely. Oh.